He arrives on a cold February day in 1847, in a small brick house in Milan, Ohio. The town is quiet, built near a canal that once promised big things but is already losing importance. His parents, Samuel and Nancy, have no way of knowing that their youngest child, called Al by most of the family, will grow into one of the most influential inventors of all time. For now, he is simply a restless baby in a house filled with the ordinary sounds of work, cooking, and the shuffle of siblings. A well-known fact about his early life is that he was the seventh and last child, born into a family already weathered by hardship and change. As he grows into a curious boy, the world around him offers endless puzzles. He watches ants move in tiny lines along the porch, follows the shape of clouds with his finger, and takes apart small gadgets whenever adults look away. His mother, a former teacher, notices the way his eyes linger on objects. She keeps old books within reach and trusts that curiosity is a better teacher than strict schedules. She becomes his anchor, especially as he begins to show signs of trouble hearing. Historians still argue whether a childhood fever, an ear infection, or even an accident on a train later in life caused his hearing loss, but whatever the reason, the world grows quieter for him. The quiet, however, becomes a kind of shelter. With fewer sounds grabbing his attention, he drifts deeper into thoughts, ideas, and imaginary experiments. One quirky early detail still told in stories is his attempt to hatch chicken eggs by sitting on them. Convinced he could coax life out with warmth and patience, the plan fails, of course, but it gives a glimpse of the determination that later defines him. When he is around 7, the family packs up their belongings and moves north to Port Huron, Michigan. The change feels huge, a shift from a small Ohio canal town to a place with open land stretching toward the blue water of Lake Huron. Their new house sits near a train line, and the distant rumble of locomotives becomes part of daily life. Here, Edison explores fields, swims in the lake, and collects bits of metal, stones, and plants to examine under the sun. School is more difficult. His teachers complain that he asks too many questions, that he can't sit still, that his mind wanders into impossible directions. Rather than fight these instincts, his mother chooses to educate him at home, guiding him with patience and thick books. One day he discovers a small chemistry book that changes everything. It explains simple experiments, the kind that can be done with basic equipment and careful hands. Soon he is gathering bottles, powders, and small tools, turning the basement into his first laboratory. The smells drifting up through the floorboards are not always pleasant, and more than once the house fills with smoke from some unexpected reaction. His father disapproves, muttering about wasted time and dangerous flames, but his mother sees the spark. As the years pass, the boy becomes a teenager with wild ideas and an appetite for work. He tries selling vegetables door to door, prints a tiny homemade newspaper, and runs errands for neighbors. Each small job teaches him something: how to speak to strangers, how to notice what people need, how to find value in things others overlook. These lessons simmer quietly in the background, setting the stage for bigger opportunities to come. He spends long afternoons near the train station, listening, or rather, feeling the rumble under his feet as the engines pass. He watches the conductors, the ticket sellers, the people carrying packages, and wonders what it would feel like to be part of that moving world. One particularly soft memory, mentioned later in old manuscripts, describes him placing his hand on the track to sense vibrations as trains approached, a trick he used when his hearing began to fail. By the time he reaches his early teens, his reputation as an odd but hard-working kid spreads. Neighbors bring him broken clocks and small machines, hoping he can repair them for a few coins. Most of the time he can, even if the process leaves springs and screws scattered across the kitchen table. There is one event during these years that becomes part of Edison's personal mythology. While selling newspapers at a train stop, he notices a toddler wandering near the tracks. A train begins rolling backward toward the child. Without thinking, he dashes forward, scoops the boy up, and leaps clear. The grateful father, a station master, offers to teach him telegraphy as thanks. This happens a little later in life, but the seeds of it are planted here in the quick decisions, the bold movements, the awareness of the constantly moving rails. For now, though, the story remains close to the family home, the basement lab, and the restless mind of a teenager. This first chapter of his life paints him not as a genius born ready, but as a curious kid shaped by a caring mother, a changing world, and the slow rhythm of rural America. Nothing here suggests the man he will become, yet when looked at closely, every small detail seems like preparation. Every hobby, every question, every misstep creates a thread leading toward the bright inventions waiting in the years ahead. The story eases forward into Edison's teenage years, when the rails begin to pull him into a wider, faster world. Port Huron's tracks offer both noise and escape, and by the time he turns 12, he is determined to earn his own money. His parents agree to let him work on the Grand Trunk Railway as a newsboy, and soon he is rising before dawn, boarding trains that rattle from Port Huron to Detroit and back again. The carriages smell of coal, dust, and warm metal, and the wooden floors shake under every shift in speed. For a boy, half-deaf and bursting with ideas, this becomes a kind of classroom on wheels. A well-known fact from these years is that he didn't just sell newspapers. He created his own tiny business empire right there on the train. He brought candies, magazines, and eventually even fresh vegetables from farms along the route, figuring out which passengers preferred what and when. People remembered him as energetic but polite, with an odd, dreamy way of staring at objects as if taking them apart in his mind. One of his clever moves involved reading morning newspaper headlines early, then promoting the day's edition with dramatic flair when he reached each station. If a major event had happened, a battle, a storm, a political scandal, he would shout just enough to stir interest. His sales soared. This simple trick, picked up from watching other sellers, taught him the power of timing. He also printed a small newspaper of his own called the Weekly Herald, using a second-hand printing press set up inside the baggage car. It is considered one of the first newspapers ever produced on a moving train. The idea was both quirky and ambitious, and like many of his early projects, surprisingly successful. Still, these years are not without mishaps. One day, while experimenting with chemicals during a trip, something he knew he wasn't supposed to do, his makeshift lab caught fire. The conductor, furious, tossed his equipment straight out of the moving train. Sparks scattered behind them, leaving Edison heartbroken but not discouraged. He later joked that losing a laboratory was becoming a familiar experience. But in this moment, he simply watched the smoke curling from the ruined chemicals and accepted that he would need to start again. The train life offered not only money and movement, but also the chance to observe technology up close. He watched telegraph operators at stations tapping messages with speed and precision. The sound of the keys, the clipped rhythm like tiny metal heartbeats, fascinated him. Even though his hearing was fading, he could feel the vibrations through the wooden counters. Historians still argue whether his fascination with telegraphy began purely out of curiosity, or partly because it allowed him to communicate without relying on sound, but the effect is the same. Telegraphy becomes the next great doorway in his life. A moment that later becomes part of Edison legend happens during this period. At a small station, a telegraph operator's young son wandered close to the tracks as a train began reversing toward him. Edison reacted instantly, pulling the child to safety. In gratitude, the boy's father, J.U. Mackenzie, offered to teach him telegraphy. It was a turning point disguised as a small act of kindness and courage. Under Mackenzie's guidance, Edison learns the patterns of dots and dashes, the timing, the discipline, and the responsibility that came with sending messages across long distances. Telegraphy required clear thinking under pressure, especially when lines were busy or weather interfered with signals. Once he grasped the system, Edison practiced constantly, often deep into the night. He set up small devices at home, tapping back and forth between them, building speed. His mother listened from another room, smiling at the rhythmic clicks echoing through the house. When he became skilled enough, he started traveling from station to station, filling in for operators who were sick or busy. The work could be tense. Messages had to be accurate, especially when managing train schedules. One well-known fact about telegraph operators at the time is that they often worked through storms, capturing faint signals through crackling lines stretched across miles of landscape. Edison would close his eyes to concentrate, filtering every vibration through touch and instinct. His hearing loss, which might have been a disadvantage to others, pushed him to develop unusual levels of focus. But not everyone was convinced he belonged in the profession. He had a habit of experimenting with equipment during quiet shifts, which sometimes caused unexpected outages. Once he attempted to automate part of the job so he could nap during long nights. His homemade device worked until it didn't. A supervisor caught him, furious, and soon he was looking for work in another town. Despite the trouble, this episode taught him something valuable about automation and the limits of machines. As he traveled, he met all kinds of people, seasoned operators with stories about storms that took down entire lines, young men chasing adventure, older workers who treated telegraphy like a sacred craft. He studied them as carefully as he studied machines, noting how they solved problems, how they stayed calm, how they adapted. These human details shaped him as much as any technical skill. One quirky moment from this time involved his attempt to send a secret message to impress another operator. He tapped out what he believed was a clever coded note, only to discover he had mistimed the spacing, making the message unintentionally rude. The operator laughed, sent a teasing reply, and Edison learned that even precise systems depend on human interpretation. Life on the rails and in the telegraph rooms carried him from one state to another. Snowstorms, summer heat, long nights in dimly lit stations, all of it blended into a blur of movement and learning. Every town had its own small stories, its own emergencies, its own rhythms. And through them all, Edison kept gathering experiences the way other people collected coins. By the end of his teenage years, he had become not only a capable telegraph operator but a young man who sensed that the world was full of hidden possibilities. The rails had carried him far from Port Huron, but they had also delivered him toward something greater. The restlessness that comes from realizing you want to build things rather than just operate them. And that quiet transition, more felt than spoken, starts guiding him toward his first true inventions. Waiting patiently just beyond these early tracks, The story now settles into the period when Edison begins shifting from operator to experimenter, from someone following systems to someone determined to build his own. By the time he reaches his early 20s, he has worked in enough telegraph offices to understand both the strengths and the flaws of the technology. The long nights, the steady rhythm of messages, the tangled problems that arose whenever storms damaged lines, these experiences carve out a specific kind of insight in him. He begins to see not just what telegraph machines do, but what they could do if redesigned. This is the quiet beginning of his inventive life. He takes a job in Boston, a city buzzing with intellectual energy and technological ambition. Though he arrives with little money and even fewer belongings, he carries a growing confidence. Boston's telegraph office gives him steady income, but what really excites him is the nearby library filled with scientific books. He spends entire evenings reading until the gas lamps flicker low. A well-known fact from this period is that he worked his way through thick volumes on physics and electricity, teaching himself mathematics he had never formally studied. He read quickly, not because he wanted to finish, but because each page seemed to open another door. This is also when he starts collecting tools and parts, slowly building a personal workspace in his rented room. Glass jars, metal scraps, bits of wire, everything has potential. At first, his experiments are simple: coils, circuits, small adjustments to existing telegraph models. But as weeks pass, his projects grow bolder. He tries to design a device that can send multiple messages over the same telegraph wire, believing that doubling or tripling line capacity would revolutionize communication. Historians still argue whether he truly built a functioning prototype during these years or simply produced promising sketches. But what says clear is that he was thinking in ambitious terms long before anyone was willing to invest in him. His room becomes a maze of components and half-finished mechanisms. One quirky detail often mentioned is that he slept so close to his scattered inventions that he occasionally woke up with gears tangled in his hair. Still, life remains unpredictable. While working nights in one telegraph office, he accidentally spilled sulfuric acid through the floorboards. It trickled into the manager's office below, destroying part of a carpet and causing a commotion that ended abruptly with the loss of his job. But Edison rarely saw failures as signs to stop. He treated them like signs to adjust. Within days he found another position and resumed tinkering during off. The moment that nudges him toward professional inventing arrives when one of his early improvements, a simple device to regulate battery power, catches the attention of a telegraph company. They buy it from him for a few $100s more money than he has ever seen at once. Holding the payment in his hands, he feels a spark of recognition. Someone is willing to pay for ideas he creates alone, in quiet rooms filled with wires and odds and ends. That payment becomes a confirmation rather than a celebration. He takes that money and moves to Newark, New Jersey, where manufacturing opportunities are growing. Newark is loud, crowded, and industrial, a place where smoke pours from chimneys and the clang of metalwork fills the air. He rents a small workshop and hires a couple of assistants. This marks his first real attempt at running an invention business, though he barely thinks of it that way. To him, it is simply a space to build without interruption. His early Newark period is filled with both breakthroughs and constant exhaustion. He takes on contracts from telegraph companies, building improved parts or entire systems. His pace is frantic. He sometimes works through the night, collapsing onto a bench for a brief nap before resuming. Visitors describe him as a man who seems both distant and intensely focused, as if he lived partly inside his own thoughts. One small but charming detail from these years is that he occasionally forgot to eat, so his assistants began leaving food directly on his workbench, sliding plates among the wires and gears. He would take absent-minded bites between experiments, barely registering what he was tasting. A well-known invention from this time is the improved stock ticker, a machine that printed stock prices onto a continuous strip of paper. The original version already existed, but Edison modified it to be more reliable. His design impressed investors so much that he was paid an unprecedented sum, tens of thousands of dollars. Suddenly he was no longer a wandering operator or a struggling tinkerer. He was a recognized inventor with the funds to expand, but even this moment of success came with uncertainty. Historians still debate whether Edison fully understood how valuable his stock ticker invention would become before he sold the rights. Some argue he could have earned far more by keeping control. Others believe he made the right choice, gaining capital that allowed him to build something even greater. Either way, this transition marks the start of his life as a professional inventor. With newfound resources, Edison hires more assistants and expands his workshop. Newark becomes a hive of activity, filled with clattering machines, the smell of oil, and the soft hum of electrical experiments. He refines telegraph improvements, explores new ways to control electricity, and constantly sketches ideas in pocket notebooks. At one point, he juggles so many simultaneous projects that he begins posting notes on the walls to keep track of tasks. This early approach to organization foreshadows the more structured environment he will later create at Menlo Park. Still, not everything is triumphant. His fast-paced workload often leads to errors. Once, After staying awake for more than 2 consecutive days, he miscalculated a design and created a device that produced sparks in unpredictable bursts. When it startled him with a sudden pop, he fell backward into a crate of metal parts. His assistants helped him up, and he laughed, brushing dust from his coat and saying he'd simply been thinking too quickly. Through all these trials and successes, one truth grows clear. He is not content to merely tweak existing machines. He wants to imagine entirely new ones. The shift from operator to inventor is complete now. Quiet but irreversible, carried by years of curiosity, failure, and stubborn momentum. As he leaves this phase of early experiments behind, the next stage of his life begins forming in his mind an idea for a dedicated laboratory, a place where invention will not be a side activity but a full, unbroken rhythm. The sparks from his Newark workshop are only a beginning, flickering hints of the brighter glow that lies just ahead. The story moves gently into the years when the telegraph world becomes Edison's proving ground, shaping his habits, sharpening his instincts, and widening the horizons of what he believes is possible. By the early 1870s, he has already built a reputation in Newark as a clever inventor who can improve almost any telegraph device. But this next stretch of his life is about something larger, understanding the full landscape of communication and learning how to build systems, not just machines. The telegraph has become the nervous system of America, stretching across cities, fields, mountains, and coasts, and Edison is determined to master its every detail. A well-known fact is that companies constantly sought him out during this time, hoping he could fix or refine their equipment. Telegraphy was not just a technology, it was a lifeline for business, news, railroads, and governments. Reliability mattered, and Edison had a talent for spotting flaws in mechanisms that others thought already perfected. He worked on transmitters, receivers, repeaters, and batteries, often creating new versions in long bursts of concentration. The world around him buzzed with change. Operators tapped messages at incredible speed in crowded offices filled with smoke from lamps and cigars. Lines regularly broke during storms, causing frantic hours of repair work. Companies competed fiercely for better equipment, trying to outpace rivals. Edison lived in the middle of this storm, and the noise of innovation matched the noise inside his mind. He became especially fascinated with the idea of sending more than one message at a time over the same wire. This concept, multiplexing, was being explored by others as well, and historians still argue whether Edison was racing against them or simply following his own path. Either way, the challenge energized him. He believed deeply that telegraph wires were being underused, that they could carry far more than anyone had imagined. His first big effort was the duplex telegraph, a system allowing 2 messages to travel in opposite directions on a single wire. He experimented endlessly, adjusting resistance levels, tweaking induction coils, and trying new switching techniques. One quirky detail from these months describes how he used household objects, including a tin pan and a stray umbrella, as part of temporary circuits when he ran out of proper components. Assistants walked around them carefully, unsure which improvised tool carried an active current. The work was frustrating but addictive. Signals overlapped, distorted, or faded entirely. At times, Edison grew so tired that he fell asleep at the bench with wires draped across his arms. Yet each time he woke, he returned to the problem with fresh determination. Eventually, after countless revisions, he produced a stable system that worked well enough for telegraph companies to take interest. It was an early victory, but the kind that made him hunger for more. Not long after the duplex success, he pushed further toward the quadruplex telegraph, which could send 4 messages at once, 2 in each direction. Many believed it was impossible. The technical hurdles were enormous, involving precise control of current strength and clever signal separation. The slightest imbalance could cause the entire system to fail. But Edison loved those tight technical margins. They felt like puzzles tailored for his mind. During this period, he worked with Western Union, the dominant telegraph company in America. Their executives saw his potential, though they also recognized his unpredictability. He could be brilliant one moment and utterly lost in thought the next. One manager complained that Edison would sometimes forget meetings because he became absorbed in a circuit problem. Yet they tolerated his eccentricities because the results were worth it. It was in these months that his hearing loss became an unusual advantage. Telegraph operators relied heavily on sound, but Edison, unable to hear clearly, focused on the underlying electrical patterns instead. He often monitored systems through vibrations or visual meters rather than clicks. His assistants noted how he seemed to sense disturbances in signals they could not yet detect. What others treated as a handicap, he folded into his method. The breakthrough eventually came, a version of the quadruplex that worked reliably enough for demonstration. Western Union executives were astonished. The system held enormous economic value because it could multiply the capacity of existing lines without laying a single new wire. Edison negotiated hard for payment, even though negotiating was not his strength. Historians still debate whether he received the full amount he deserved, but he walked away with substantial funds enough to begin thinking on a grander scale. During these years, life around him stayed chaotic but lively. His Newark workshop hummed with activity from morning until late night. Assistants hurried between benches, tools clattered, and the floors were littered with wire clippings and bits of metal. Edison often slept in the laboratory, wrapped in a blanket, his boots still on. One humorous detail recalled in later interviews is that he once used a pile of telegraph batteries as a pillow, waking with faint imprints on the side of his face. But beneath the noise and the rush, something deeper was forming, a vision of an organized research environment built specifically for invention. He was beginning to understand that innovation did not have to happen in cramped rooms or improvised workshops. It could be planned, structured, supported by teams, and scaled with purpose. Newark had been productive, but it felt too small, too reactive. Edison wanted a place where he could think ahead, dream bigger, and gather people who shared his restless energy as the telegraph world continued evolving around him. Pushing demands higher and higher, Edison sensed that his greatest work would not come from improving someone else's machines. It would come from building entirely new systems, ones that people had not even imagined yet. His mind was moving beyond telegraph wires and tapping keys, toward a broader kind of invention that combined creativity with industry. And somewhere in the midst of all this, a plan began forming, a dedicated laboratory in a quiet town. A place where he could control every detail, from the tools on the benches to the pace of the experiments. A place where ideas would not just be tested but multiplied. A place soon to be known around the world as Menlo Park. The story moves gently into the next chapter of Edison's life. The period when Newark's crowded workshop begins to feel too small for the ambitions forming in his mind. Success with the telegraph and the steady flow of contracts have brought money and reputation. But what he truly craves now is space, physical, mental, and creative. Newark is loud, gritty, and unpredictable. It teaches him resilience, but it also limits him. He begins dreaming of a place where invention can become a full-time rhythm rather than something squeezed between commercial assignments. And with this shift in desire, his next setting begins to take shape, Menlo Park. Before the move, though, Edison's Newark years deserve a closer look, because this is where he develops the habits and patterns that define him for decades. His workshop at Ward Street is famously chaotic. Wires dangling from shelves, jars filled with unknown liquids, piles of gears on the floor, and at least 3 separate projects underway at any moment. Assistants describe him as a whirlwind, moving from bench to bench with a kind of restless precision, offering instructions so quickly they sometimes struggled to write them down. A well-known fact from this era is that Edison, despite his growing success, still treated the workshop like a living experiment. He built improved versions of stock tickers, printing telegraphs, automatic repeaters, and battery-powered devices. He accepted nearly any contract if it sounded interesting, regardless of how long it would take or how difficult the problem might be. Money mattered, but ideas mattered more. Some days he barely noticed whether the business was profitable. He simply wanted to see if something worked. Amid the clutter, his first real team begins to take shape. Skilled machinists, draftsmen, and young experimenters gather around him, each learning to keep pace with his unpredictable schedule. Edison often slept on a workbench or on the floor, wrapped in a coat with his boots still on. One quirky detail often told about this period is how he would suddenly jump up from a half-sleep, shout the solution to a problem he had been wrestling with earlier, and immediately start building again. His assistants were startled the first few times, but soon they learned to prepare tools beforehand, assuming that a midnight idea was always possible. The workshop also becomes a social hub. Investors stop by, telegraph executives drop in to check on progress, and curious locals peek through open doors just to catch a glimpse of the wizard at work. Edison rarely notices them unless they ask a question he finds interesting. His mind remains focused on circuits, gears, and the invisible pathways of electricity. But Newark is not all triumphs. The pace nearly breaks him. Long hours blur into longer days, and the constant pressure to deliver improvements becomes overwhelming. He loses contracts more than once because he forgets deadlines while working on unrelated projects. His business partner at the time, William Unger, grows frustrated with Edison's unpredictable habits. At one point, a major client shows up unannounced and finds Edison asleep on a pile of blankets next to a half-finished machine. The client assumes he is sick. In truth, he has simply been awake for 2 days straight. Still, the reputation of his abilities continues to spread. Western Union considers him one of their most valuable outside inventors. People speak of him as a man whose mind runs ahead of his hands, but Edison knows something they do not. He is reaching the limits of what a small workshop can handle. He wants a place designed for creation, not just adaptation. Newark is where he built his confidence, but he senses it cannot carry him into the future. Historians still argue whether the idea for Menlo Park was originally Edison's or whether investors encouraged him to seek a quieter location. Some believe that the isolated property appealed to him because it offered peace and room for expansion. Others think he chose it simply because it was affordable and near a railroad line. Regardless of the debate, the vision becomes clear to him. A laboratory unlike any other where he can dream without interruption and build with a team that shares his hunger for discovery. Before the move, he marries Mary Stilwell, a young woman who worked in one of his Newark shops. Their courtship is brief, shaped by Edison's unconventional schedule and his habit of explaining electrical concepts during casual moments. One story recalls how he attempted to teach Mary Morse code as a romantic gesture. She found it sweet, though difficult to follow at first. Their marriage adds warmth to his life, though Edison, always focused on work, sometimes forgets to balance home and laboratory. As he prepares to relocate, Edison begins organizing his notes with more intention. He buys land in Menlo Park, New Jersey, then little more than a quiet area with a few scattered buildings, and starts designing his new laboratory from the ground up. This decision marks the true beginning of his most creative era. Moving day is chaotic but hopeful. Crates of machinery, fragile instruments, notebooks and tools are loaded onto wagons. Assistants joke about losing track of important components among the clutter, but gradually everything arrives at the new site. The laboratory he builds there becomes legendary. 2 floors of open space, filled with benches, lathes, chemicals, batteries, and shelves that reach toward the ceiling. Large windows let in the daylight, and at night oil lamps glow warmly over the work tables. Edison walks through the new building with a sense of relief. At last he has a place where ideas can breathe. The silence of Menlo Park contrasts sharply with Newark's constant noise. Here, the loudest sounds are tools, conversation, and the occasional train passing nearby. Within days, the lab begins filling with activity. Edison establishes routines, loose ones, but enough to keep progress steady. Assistants live nearby so they can join experiments at any hour. Visitors describe Menlo Park as a place where inspiration feels almost physical, hanging in the air between wires and glass tubes. A well-known moment from this early Menlo Park period is the first evening when Edison gathers his team to discuss the purpose of the lab. He tells them it will be dedicated to producing a minor invention every 10 days and a major one every 6 months. The goals are absurdly ambitious, but Edison says them calmly, with the confidence of someone who has already envisioned the results. He is no longer a young telegraph operator searching for opportunity. He is a builder of systems, the leader of a growing team, and a man stepping into the most creative decade of his life. And as the Menlo Park lamps glow late into the night, the next chapter filled with sound, electricity, and worldwide attention prepares to unfold quietly around him. The glow of Menlo Park was no longer just a dream. It was becoming tangible in ways that touched not only Edison's mind but the world around him. With the first successful long-lasting bulbs burning steadily, the lab hummed with renewed energy, and the sense of possibility spread through the town like soft sunlight. Edison's days were filled with testing, adjusting, and perfecting every aspect of the system. Assistants worked alongside him, calibrating filaments, refining vacuum tubes, and sketching small improvements in careful notebooks. The air always carried a faint scent of carbonized wood and warm glass, a quiet reminder that these experiments were more than abstract ideas. They were shaping real, practical light. A well-known fact from this period is that the Menlo Park team produced over 1,000 variations of filaments before finding one durable enough for practical use. Yet behind this achievement lay a series of long, repetitive days and nights, where Edison often slept in short bursts on benches, only to rise again and return to the bench, testing filament after filament. One quirky detail recalls Edison using a bundle of cotton string soaked in carbon as a temporary filament, joking to an assistant that if it lights, it's good enough for poetry. The atmosphere in the lab combined exhaustion, humor, and quiet excitement. Historians still argue whether the Menlo Park team understood fully the broader implications of what they had created. Some suggest that Edison was focused narrowly on creating a stable bulb, while others believe he was already imagining networks of light stretching across cities. Regardless of intent, the work laid the foundation for something entirely new, the concept of electrifying homes, streets, and businesses with a system designed from scratch rather than simply improving gas lighting. As the bulbs proved themselves, attention turned toward designing a complete electrical network. Edison realized that a functioning bulb was only part of the problem. The wires, switches, and generators needed to reach homes and businesses in a way that was reliable, safe, and scalable. Experiments with dynamos and storage systems filled the days, as assistants balanced practical construction with ongoing testing. Small triumphs were celebrated quietly, often with only a nod from Edison, who remained focused on the next challenge. By late 1879, the first public demonstrations began taking shape. Edison carefully prepared a small network of lights in the lab, showcasing the steady glow to visitors, investors, and journalists. The effect was mesmerizing. Rooms filled with bright, even illumination that felt warmer, steadier, and safer than gas lamps. One assistant recalled how attendees were startled to see the lamps remain lit for hours, without flickering or producing smoke, their astonishment a quiet thrill echoing through the workshop. Edison watched calmly, noting every reaction, already thinking about improvements and scaling. Yet even as excitement grew, the work remained painstaking. Every connection had to be tested, every wire checked, and the team spent long hours planning how to expand this new system to entire streets. Failure was always possible. A small miscalculation could dim a light or overheat a circuit. And still, the sense of forward momentum of something both monumental and intimate carried the lab through the long nights. The Menlo Park team began to feel like pioneers, walking carefully into a world illuminated not by flames, but by electricity. By the end of this period, Edison's vision of electrified life was no longer theoretical. The lamps worked. The systems were being designed for real neighborhoods. And as the quiet glow of Menlo Park stretched into early demonstrations, it became clear that these small, careful experiments would ripple outward, shaping the next decades of modern life. The stage was set for the broader public to witness what Edison and his team had accomplished, and the world's evening hours would never be the same. The work unfolding at Menlo Park had already reshaped the atmosphere around Thomas Edison. But as the months passed, his attention narrowed toward a challenge that felt almost impossible. The idea of producing a safe, steady, affordable electric light was circling through scientific circles everywhere. Yet no one had managed to push it from dream to daily reality. Gas lamps still ruled the evenings, flickering and hissing with their familiar warmth. But they also carried a certain danger. Fires were common. Air quality dropped in closed rooms, and the light came with a cost. Many families could barely justify. These truths stayed on Edison's mind, especially during the calm hours of the night when the lab fell quiet and he walked between workbenches still warm from long days of experiments. The popular story, the one that children repeat in simple phrases, is that Edison suddenly decided to invent the light bulb out of thin air. But as mentioned earlier in the old manuscript of Menlo Park Notes, the real story was far slower, layered with technical frustrations and unexpected breakthroughs. A well-known fact often retold is that Edison tested thousands of filament materials, from carbonized threads to slivers of wood. Yet behind that famous number was the constant rhythm of experimentation, with assistants scribbling data under lamplight and Edison pacing with quiet determination. The idea wasn't just to produce a glow. He needed something reliable, something that could last far longer than the short-lived attempts made by others before him. Historians still argue whether Edison truly believed from the start that his team could perfect an entire electrical lighting system, not just the bulb itself. Some scholars suggest that his vision expanded only after early tests showed promise, while others insist he always planned for a complete network of power generation, wiring and control. That debate continues, but what is certain is that once the possibility settled in his mind, he pursued it with a clarity that left little room for hesitation. The quirky detail that rarely appears in textbooks is how the lab occasionally smelled like overcooked food during carbonization tests. One assistant joked that they were burning everything except their lunches. Bamboo splints, cotton strings, cardboard shavings, each was turned into fragile, blackened filaments, carefully placed inside glass bulbs. Many shattered, some flickered briefly before dying, and a few survived long enough to stir real excitement. Yet Edison kept his emotional reactions surprisingly even. He always seemed less interested in the brief flashes of success and more in the patterns hidden beneath numbers and failed trials. By late 1879, the sense of anticipation around Menlo Park had grown almost electric itself. Journalists lingered outside the lab fences, hoping to hear rumors carried on the wind. Investors sent letters urging quick results. The public imagination stretched like a rising tide, eager for whatever wonder Edison might reveal next. Inside the lab, though, life remained methodical. Every morning began with new glass bulbs being prepared, pumps hissing to remove air, and careful adjustments to materials that might produce stronger, steadier filaments. One evening in October brought the turning point that would eventually be told in countless classrooms. A carefully prepared carbon filament, shaped like a delicate horseshoe, burned with a soft, steady light that refused to fade. Minutes passed, then hours, and the glow remained. The team stood around the bulb with quiet amazement, half afraid to breathe on it. Edison watched with the calm focus of someone who had imagined this moment so many times that its arrival felt strangely familiar. Still, he didn't celebrate too quickly. It was one thing to produce a successful test, and another to create a design durable enough for daily life. Days of further refinements followed, each building on the last. When the team finally reached a filament that lasted more than 40 hours, a subtle shift spread across the lab. The possibility that had once felt out of reach was now glowing in front of them. Word traveled fast. Soon the lab became a destination for visitors hoping to witness the new invention. Edison, ever the showman when needed, understood the value of timing. Rather than rushing into announcements, he planned a public demonstration that would unfold like a quiet spectacle. The grounds around Menlo Park were decorated with wires and lamps, forming a network that would light up the entire area. Assistants worked through the cold days of December, preparing every detail so that when the switch was thrown, the world would see not just a bulb, but an entire system ready to change how people lived after sunset. On New Year's Eve of 1879, crowds gathered, their breath forming pale clouds in the winter air. The moment the lights came alive, a soft gasp rippled through the crowd. Menlo Park glowed with a warm, even light that seemed almost impossible compared to the unsteady flames people were used to. For many visitors, the idea of electricity flowing through wires like an invisible river bordered on magic. Children pointed, adults whispered, and even skeptics found themselves caught in the calm wonder of it. Newspapers declared the event a triumph. Investors saw opportunity. Cities began to imagine a future where streets stayed illuminated long after dusk. Edison's team, for their part, felt a mixture of pride and exhaustion. They knew the work ahead would be immense. Lighting homes, businesses, and entire districts required not just bulbs but generators, wiring systems, switches, and safety measures. Yet in that moment, as the lights continued to glow through the night, it was clear that something had changed forever. Edison himself took a rare moment of quiet satisfaction. He once said that genius was 1% inspiration and 99% perspiration, a phrase he repeated so often that it became part of his image. But walking through the illuminated grounds that night, he seemed more reflective than triumphant. The glow wasn't just a technical victory. It was proof that persistence, careful observation, and a willingness to fail repeatedly could carve a new path in the world. As winter gave way to spring, Menlo Park buzzed with new tasks. Production plans developed, patents were filed, and discussions with city officials began. The invention of the electric light had shifted from dream to practice, and now the real effort lay in bringing it to ordinary people's homes. Assistants worked longer hours. Shipments of supplies arrived constantly, and Edison moved from room to room with the steady purpose of someone who saw the road ahead and knew it had only just begun. The light bulb had become more than an invention. It was a symbol of possibility. It hinted at a world where night no longer dictated the rhythm of life, where factories could run longer, and where families could read by a steady glow rather than a flickering flame. And as the story continued, the glow from Menlo Park would follow Edison into his next great challenges, carrying its quiet promise into each chapter of his life. The glow that spread outward from Menlo Park carried Thomas Edison into a new and complicated chapter, one shaped not only by invention but by rivalry, public fascination, and the shifting landscape of electrical power. As the newly perfected light spread into newspapers and city offices, another idea began circulating alongside it. What kind of current should carry electricity into people's homes? The answer seemed simple at first. Edison championed direct current, or DC, a steady and predictable flow that he believed offered safety and reliability. But just as the public was adjusting to the idea of electrified streets, another system quietly rose to challenge his vision. Alternating current, known as AC, moved electricity in a wave-like pattern, allowing it to travel long distances with ease. At first glance it seemed like a remote competitor, but as months passed, this technology began to attract the attention of investors and engineers looking for cheaper, more flexible systems. Edison watched these developments from Menlo Park with a mix of curiosity and concern. He had built his entire lighting philosophy around DC power, believing strongly in its potential to create safer neighborhoods and calmer indoor spaces. A well-known fact often echoed in documentaries is that AC ultimately became the dominant method of electrical distribution, but the path toward that outcome was far from smooth. As mentioned earlier in the old accounts of Menlo Park, Edison wasn't someone who ignored a challenge. Once he understood that AC was gaining ground, he entered the debate with full force. Determined to protect the system he believed would serve the public best, his discussions with city officials, investors, and reporters became sharper, though always delivered with his familiar mix of confidence and fast-thinking practicality. Historians still argue whether Edison's stance against AC was rooted more in genuine concern or in the desire to defend his growing electrical empire. Some argue that his warnings were shaped by scientific caution, pointing out how higher voltages could indeed be dangerous if handled poorly. Others claim he feared losing control of a market he had worked tirelessly to build. The truth likely rests somewhere in the middle, a blend of personal conviction, business pressure, and the natural resistance that any inventor feels when a competing vision rises too quickly. The episodes that unfolded during these years sometimes took unusual turns. A quirky detail rarely mentioned today is that Edison and his team once tested the potential dangers of AC by powering various devices and even performing demonstrations with barnyard animals in controlled settings. These displays weren't meant as cruelty, as the lab accounts suggest, but rather as dramatic warnings presented to officials considering new electrical contracts. Still, these efforts created a complicated legacy, one that shows how tense and competitive the era had become. While Edison defended DC power, his workshops continued humming with activity. New lamps were produced, improved wiring methods were tested, and plans for power stations spread from cities to towns and industrial districts. Workers described the atmosphere at Menlo Park as both exciting and exhausting. The discussions about AC power occasionally slipped into conversations during long evenings of testing and repairs, but the team remained focused on pushing their system forward. Public opinion, meanwhile, drifted between fascination and confusion. Electricity itself was still new to most people, and debates about the best current system seemed abstract compared to the simple wonder of a glowing street lamp. Newspaper articles often dramatized the rivalry, turning engineering disagreements into lively stories for readers who were still trying to understand the difference between a filament and a fuse. Around this time, Nikola Tesla entered the wider electrical scene, advocating strongly for alternating current. Although Tesla and Edison are often portrayed as personal enemies, the reality was more nuanced. Their working paths crossed only briefly, and while disagreements existed, the louder tensions emerged mostly among their supporters and the companies backing each system. Edison himself, according to some early employees, was more focused on the practical progress of his own network than on trading insults. Yet the public liked a dramatic story, and soon their rivalry took on a life of its own. During these years, Edison also continued exploring new industries connected to electricity. He experimented with improved generators, distribution stations, and household devices that could operate safely under DC power. His notebooks from this period reveal the steady rhythm of his mind. Sketches, quick calculations, sudden ideas scribbled between appointments, and small notes reminding himself of materials to test. Even as competition grew, his days remained anchored in the hands-on problem-solving that had always defined him. Despite the growing attention around AC systems, DC continued to find practical uses in cities where shorter transmission distances made it easy to manage. Factories appreciated the predictable current. Theaters installed DC lights to create steady illumination for their stages. Edison traveled often, consulting on installations and guiding electrical workers who were learning the delicate art of connecting new neighborhoods to underground wires. Yet the momentum behind AC continued to build. Companies promoting it expanded rapidly, and soon entire city projects were designed around its long-distance capabilities. Edison watched this rise without surrendering his own system, but with an increasing awareness that the world of electricity was too vast for one approach to dominate completely. As mentioned in earlier sections, he had never been afraid of a challenge, and this transitional period would not spare him from heavy decisions. Even during these turbulent years, moments of calm appeared. Late at night, after the last of the workers left the lab, Edison sometimes walked through the testing rooms, adjusting wires, inspecting filaments, or taking quiet notes. One assistant later recalled how Edison would stand silently before a glowing lamp, as if contemplating not just its light but the world it represented, a world transformed by forces once invisible and unimaginable. By the late 1880s, the so-called current war had settled into a kind of uneasy balance. AC gained attention for large-scale distribution while DC held onto smaller networks and specialized uses. Edison eventually shifted his focus toward new fields, accepting that the electrical landscape would never stand still for long. The rivalry had left its mark on newspapers, companies, and city planning, but it also showed a deeper truth, that progress often unfolds through the push and pull of competing visions, each shaped by the passion of those pursuing them. And for Edison, whose life always seemed to move toward the next experiment, this era became another chapter of lessons, challenges, and the constant search for ideas that could brighten the world in new ways. As the debates over electrical systems slowly cooled, Thomas Edison found his attention drifting toward fresh landscapes of possibility. The late 1880s and early 1890s brought a shift in both his work and the pace of his days. The atmosphere at Menlo Park had changed over time, and with new competitors, new industries, and new demands rising in every direction, he made the decision to move his operations to a larger, more advanced laboratory in West Orange, New Jersey. This new space, filled with sunlight and high ceilings, felt less like a workshop and more like a small industrial village. It became the center for his next wave of creations. One well-known fact that often emerges when people discuss this period is Edison's deep involvement with sound recording. The phonograph, which he had invented years earlier almost as a curious side project, now returned to his focus with renewed force. As mentioned earlier in the old manuscript of Menlo Park stories, the phonograph began as a device that scratched faint recordings onto tinfoil, but at West Orange it became something else entirely, a machine capable of capturing voices with surprising clarity. Visitors who heard it for the first time described the experience as unsettling and magical, like hearing an echo from another room where no one stood. Edison threw himself into refining both the device and the business around it. He believed that recorded sound could reshape entertainment, education, and even daily communication. Historians still argue whether he fully appreciated the cultural force the phonograph would one day hold. Some say he saw it mostly as a practical tool, something that could store office dictation or preserve important messages. Others insist he understood instinctively that music and storytelling would one day travel through homes using machines just like his. Whatever the truth, his efforts during this period laid the groundwork for an entirely new industry. A quirky detail from this era is that Edison tested new phonograph designs by recording his own voice, reading simple phrases or joking with assistants, sometimes leaving small verbal notes for the future. These recordings, preserved today, reveal a man whose workday included moments of spontaneous play, slipping humor into an otherwise intense routine. The lab staff enjoyed these interludes, though they rarely interrupted him uninvited. They knew he could turn serious again in a single breath. Meanwhile, electricity itself continued spreading across cities, though Edison's direct involvement began to ease. The companies he helped create expanded, merged, and evolved, sometimes in directions he did not choose. The electrical landscape grew beyond any one inventor's full control, a natural step, but one that carried a quiet ache for someone who had imagined shaping it more completely. Still, he never lingered on that feeling for long. His mind always drifted toward whatever puzzle sat closest on the table. One of those puzzles was motion. Edison became fascinated with the idea of capturing movement the same way he had captured sound. The notion wasn't entirely new. Others had tinkered with high-speed photography and early moving picture toys, but Edison wanted something more stable, more repeatable, something that could draw entire stories through sequences of light. Work began on what would eventually become the kinetoscope, a device allowing viewers to peer into a small window and watch short moving scenes. Unlike modern film projection, it served one viewer at a time, but in the early 1890s, it felt like a small miracle. The process behind it required countless experiments with film strips, shutters, and light sources. Edison's team built small stages for performers to dance, act, or simply move so the camera could test each improvement in real time. These early productions were simple, often lasting just a few seconds, but the excitement surrounding them grew quickly. The West Orange lab began to feel like a mixture of science hall and theater studio. Assistants found themselves adjusting cameras 1 hour and sweeping sawdust from makeshift sets the next, feeling the strange thrill of stepping into a future that seemed to shimmer just ahead. As the kinetoscope gained attention, Edison also pushed forward with improvements to mining equipment, batteries, and chemical processes. The variety of projects swirling through the lab at this time created a daily rhythm that was both chaotic and invigorating. Visitors described the place as a maze of sounds, the clatter of metal, the hum of motors, the faint echo of recorded voices drifting from phonograph rooms. Edison moved through it all with a steady, unhurried stride, pausing only when an idea sparked or a new question formed. Though success surrounded him, the years weren't without strain. The pressure of maintaining so many ventures sometimes weighed heavily on his schedule and finances. Patents piled up, but overseeing their development required endless attention. His personal life, too, carried quiet challenges as he worked to balance family moments with the demands of invention. Yet even in these more complicated chapters, those closest to him noticed a familiar pattern. Whenever difficulties grew too loud, he returned to the quiet bench in whatever room he favored that month, sketching new possibilities until the weight eased. By the late 1890s, Edison was seen not just as an inventor but as a symbol of American industriousness. Children learned his name in school books, reporters visited frequently. His workshop became a destination for travelers curious about the strange devices shaping the next century. But beneath all that attention, he remained surprisingly unchanged. His habits stayed simple, his humor stayed dry, and his curiosity, the same restless spark that had followed him since childhood, moved steadily toward the next horizon. As the century inched closer to its end, Edison prepared to leave behind some of his earlier technologies and embrace newer frontiers. The world was shifting, faster than before, and he sensed it with a mixture of excitement and calm acceptance. What he had built so far had illuminated streets, captured voices, preserved motion, and introduced ideas that rippled far beyond his laboratory walls. But for him, the story wasn't ending. It was simply turning toward another path, one he already felt eager to follow. As the 20th century approached, Thomas Edison stepped into his later years with the same gentle determination that had guided him since childhood. The West Orange laboratory remained the center of his work, but its atmosphere shifted as new faces joined the team and older assistants moved into their own ventures. Edison himself, though aging, continued to walk the long corridors with a thoughtful pace, observing experiments, suggesting small adjustments, and listening to the steady hum of machines that seemed to echo every chapter of his life. One well-known fact from this period is that Edison devoted a tremendous amount of time to perfecting storage batteries. He believed rechargeable batteries would shape the future of transportation and industry, and he poured years into refining them. The chemistry was difficult, full of unexpected failures and long test phases, yet he continued forward. As mentioned earlier in old accounts from the West Orange notebooks, Edison treated failure almost like a traveling companion, greeting it with a nod whenever it appeared, and then turning immediately to the next attempt. Historians still argue whether his commitment to battery technology was driven more by scientific curiosity or by his desire to create a dependable power source for electric vehicles, which he believed would soon spread across cities. Some scholars claim he saw too far ahead of his time, while others suggest he underestimated the challenges of the chemistry involved. Even now, when modern batteries have become common in cars and devices, the debate continues quietly in corners of academic discussions. A quirky detail from these years is how Edison sometimes napped in random places around the lab, on benches, on piles of paperwork, even under tables when exhaustion caught up with him. Staff members learned to step quietly around him, knowing that a brief rest often restored his energy and sent him back into long stretches of concentrated work. More than once, a visiting reporter searching for the famous inventor was startled to find him asleep in a chair with his arms folded and a pencil still tucked behind one ear. Edison's home life shifted gently as well. His children grew older, and quiet moments with his family became more precious. He enjoyed long walks on the property, where the trees carried the soft rustle of seasonal change. He sometimes brought new gadgets home to demonstrate them during dinner, filling the room with a mixture of wonder and laughter. Despite his fame, his personal routines remained simple. He cherished calm evenings, light conversation, and the comfort of familiar surroundings. His work, however, never slowed entirely. New industries called to him: rubber, cement, and improvements to manufacturing processes. The challenges varied, but the familiar pattern remained. He gathered notes, sketched ideas, and tested early designs with the patient rhythm that had shaped his entire career. Some of these projects found success, while others faded quietly, overshadowed by larger discoveries unfolding in other fields. But regardless of public interest, Edison approached each idea with the same grounded curiosity. In these later years, he also took time to look back. Visitors who sat with him described a man who seldom glorified his own accomplishments. Instead, he spoke about the long nights, the unexpected turns, and the team members whose hands shaped the inventions alongside him. He occasionally retold stories from Menlo Park, laughing softly at memories that seemed both distant and vivid. As mentioned earlier in the accounts of the light bulb demonstrations, he still carried a quiet pride about those early days when the lab glowed for the very first time. The world outside continued to change rapidly. Telephones spread through cities, automobiles filled streets, and motion pictures began transforming entertainment in ways no one had predicted. Edison watched these developments with calm interest, knowing that innovation had moved beyond the walls of any single laboratory. His own inventions had played a role in shaping this pace, but he didn't cling to the past or lament the progress of others. Instead, he welcomed each new idea as another step in the ever-widening path of discovery. As his health began to waver, Edison spent more time at home. Still, he found comfort in walking through his property, observing the sky shift between seasons and listening to the small sounds around him: the soft scrape of branches in wind, the distant tick of machinery from the lab buildings, the quiet conversations of workers who still carried out daily tasks. He enjoyed sitting near windows with warm sunlight on the floor, reviewing notes or sketching small ideas that drifted through his mind like passing thoughts. One late chapter that often moves those who read about it is the final collaboration between Edison and Henry Ford, who had long admired him. Ford had built a small replica of Edison's Menlo Park laboratory, restoring it detail by detail as a tribute. Edison visited the site, walking through rooms that mirrored the ones where he had once tested filaments and tools. The moment was bittersweet, a living echo of the past, recreated with deep respect. He stepped slowly through the space, touching workbenches and tools with a soft smile, as if greeting old friends he hadn't seen in decades. As the end of his life approached in 1931, Edison remained surrounded by family. Those last days were calm, marked by quiet conversations and the soft murmur of footsteps in nearby hallways. With his passing, the world paused in a rare moment of shared reflection. Lights were dimmed in places across the country, symbolic gestures honoring the man who had reshaped how evenings unfolded. Newspapers published long tributes, recounting not only his inventions but the spirit of persistence and imagination that had carried him across so many decades of change. And though time carried the world forward, the glow of Edison's work remained steady, woven into the fabric of daily life, in the hum of electric lights, the warmth of recorded voices, the flicker of motion pictures, and the countless technologies that grew from seeds he planted. His story, stretching from a curious boy in Ohio to a global figure of innovation, left behind a quiet reminder of what determination, patience, and unwavering curiosity can create. Now the pace softens, settling into a slow, gentle rhythm, almost like watching a calm evening drift across a quiet landscape. The long chapters of Thomas Edison's life begin to fold softly, one over the other, until they rest like pages of a book comfortably closed. His journey, filled with glowing moments of discovery and long trails of patient effort, lingers in the air the way warm light lingers in a room long after sunset. You might imagine him in those peaceful twilight years, stepping through his garden with an easy stride, listening not to machines or experiments, but to the gentle rustle of leaves and the familiar sounds of home. The world kept moving forward, faster and brighter, but Edison himself found serenity in the slower hours, where ideas drifted through his thoughts like distant lanterns floating on still water. In this softened space, every invention becomes less a triumph and more a quiet ripple, part of a larger, calmer story. His life stretches backward like a glowing thread, from the hum of early telegraph lines to the warm radiance of the first electric lamps, from the faint scratch of tinfoil recordings to the gentle shuffle of early motion pictures. And as this thread gently fades into the background, it leaves behind a warm, steady glow meant simply to soothe. So let the final images drift. A workshop dimly lit, a pencil resting on a bench, a lamp glowing softly in the corner, the outside world falling quiet as night settles in. Let the calm settle around you too, a gentle reminder that even the brightest minds eventually return to stillness. And as the last traces of this story settle, allow yourself to drift with them, slowly, peacefully, into rest.